Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our August Consumer and Community Involvement lunchtime seminar. It's great to have you all joining us. We'll just wait another minute or so. We can still see quite a few people joining, and then we'll get started. But welcome. Thanks, everyone. The focus of our August seminar is consumer and community involvement and ethics, and we've got some great speakers joining us today. I'm Angela Jones. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Monash Partners Academic Health Science Centre, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's seminar, along with our presenters, Angela Henjak, Georgia Ramsey, Jack Germain, Deborah Dell, and Pauline Hopkins. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us for our webinar today. For those of you that may be new, this is a monthly series that aims to provide some practical advice, frameworks and resources to support you in your consumer and community involvement. It's around our purpose of connecting clinicians, researchers, managers and consumers to innovate for better health. Today's seminar is being audio and video recorded, and we will save the chat and we'll also send you a summary of the key points via an email in the next week or two. Just to briefly run through our seminar today, Debbie Dell from Monash Health is going to kick off talking about consumer and community involvement in research and providing some clarification around when ethics approval is required. And Debbie's also going to provide some suggestions around how consumers can be involved in preparing an ethics application. We're very lucky today also to have an HREC lay member, Pauline Hopkins from Monash Health, joining us to provide some perspectives. Then we'll hand over to Angela Henjak from the Alfred, who's going to talk to us around the various ways in which human research ethics committees partner with consumers. And then Georgia Ramsey and Jack Germain are going to speak about how consumers have been involved in a clinical trial that they're leading over at the Alfred. As always, we'll have time at the end for discussion and questions. So Sandy Braff, our CCI, Monash Partners CCI Fellow, is also joining us today and supporting this event. Please feed your questions through the chat as we're going through the session, and we'll respond, and we'll also hold some of those questions over for our panellists at the end. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen or to remind you about our online resources as well. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and it's my great pleasure now to introduce Debbie Dell. Debbie is the Manager of Research Support Services at Monash Health, and she's also the Interim Director of Research Operations at Monash Health. Debbie, over to you, and thank you so much for supporting our seminar today.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that lovely introduction and invitation today. So thanks also to everyone who's registered for this seminar. So I work at Monash Health in Research Support Services, and as part of my role, I serve as the Executive Officer to the Human Research Ethics Committee. And quite a common question that we're often asked is it a requirement to seek human research ethics approval prior to engaging with a consumer to be involved as a consumer in the research design? And the answer is no. So you don't need to seek human research ethics approval if you are wishing to utilize the expertise of a consumer in research. We provide that advice because if you think about it, researchers, when they're looking at expertise for a study, such as biostatisticians or lawyers, pharmacists, medical physicists. They don't seek human research ethics approval to seek that expertise. They're seeking it as a value add, as an integral component when they're designing research. So seeking consumer involvement is just as integral as all of the other components that we would expect in a robust application. So whilst it's not, there's many things that a consumer might actually provide advice on, which can really value add to a study. So it might be things around the pragmatics of the study visits, the recruitment strategy, the informed consent process, things like how information is presented to people, also things like what would be acceptable forms of reimbursement or out-of-pocket expenses, those sorts of things, and also what the appropriateness of potentially sharing a results of a study might look like. So, some people might like to receive things by letter, SMS, or what those mean, what's the best communication methods. So those are just some of the issues that a consumer might have some really value add aspects to add when a research team's putting together an application, but it's by no means an extensive list. It's just some of, I guess, the more obvious things that come up. So whilst it's not necessary to seek human research ethics approval prior to engaging with the consumer to provide expertise on a proposal, there's certainly, if you like, some principles that should be followed and should be considered just as we would if we were engaging with any colleagues in research. And that's really thinking about, what the expectations are from both parties. What's the time commitment look like from the consumer? What are we specifically asking for advice and expertise on? How are we really thinking about when we're scheduling, research team meetings, what that looks like for a consumer who may have other commitments, and that this is voluntary and those sorts of things. That's really the considerations of, how do we make it work, and really importantly, how do we make it work so that it's not a tokenistic approach. It's really a real partnership that extends beyond perhaps one project, that becomes, just as we would with people we work with regularly, you seem to go back to the same people because you've got a great working relationship. So it's thinking about the long-term relationship that we have with our colleagues and consumers. Would certainly, we should be looking to establish those relationships. So at Monash recently, we've had a really great example recently of a study where this was really well done, and I thought that I would share it because it's a simple example, but it's not a simple example. And I have the permission of our wonderful oncology team at Monash to share this example. So recently, the Monash Health Human Research Ethics Committee received this application involving post-vaccine surveillance in oncology patients. And the initial protocol was quite, if you like, intense in its expectations of participants, that it initially had required that participants would need to come to the health service each week for blood tests, which was somewhat onerous, and particularly in instances like we find ourselves in at the moment, where that's not really an essential activity for someone to be doing. So the two consumers that oncology work with quite regularly provided some really great feedback about the pragmatics of that requirement, and they questioned if it was really necessary for the science of the protocol. And the research team took that back to where the protocol had originated with the initial writers of that protocol, and they had provided this feedback around the schedule of assessments and, really was it necessary each week, and that would be a limitation to many people providing informed consent to go into the study. And if there could be perhaps some consideration given to timing the taking of those blood samples with usual patient visits, would that be something that could be incorporated? That suggestion was taken on board in full, and the as it stands now, that study only requires that the samples are taken when people are already attending the health service for their usual visits, and that has seen the recruitment it's far exceeded what had been initially hoped. And it's because people are really engaged and really see it as, look, this is something they want to be part of. It's not really onerous on them, and they're literally not presenting sort of any issues around that this is inconvenient or what have you. So I raise this as an example because in this instance, whilst the consumers raised an issue for them that was around pragmatics, they also were able to question really, if you like, well, is there a scientific reason why we do this? Is it necessary? Because we're trying to get our heads around it. And it really did help shape the conduct of the study. And so on that note, I thought, we thought as a group that it would be really helpful to hear from one of our lay members on the Monash Health Human Research Ethics Committee, and to share some of their observations of what it's like when we receive applications that have great consumer input. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and introduce you to Pauline Hopkins, who's a consumer representative of Monash Health and a number of advisory groups at Monash Health, and she's also a lay member on our Human Research Ethics Committee.
Debbie, is Pauline in the group that we need to unmute her, perhaps?
I do believe so, Angela. I can see Pauline is in the participant group, yes.
Okay. Terrific. Great. Pauline, if you just unmute yourself, then we should be able to hear from you, and if it's convenient to turn your camera on also.
Okay.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. I've been on the whole time, but I didn't have the options for unmuting. So anyway, hopefully it's all working well now. So thank you very much for that, Debbie. So just to give people a little bit of background about me, so because I'm a stranger to most people. So I've been a volunteer at Monash since about 2003. I think I began work on the Community Advisory Committee, and I've had various roles and been on various committees over time. So at the moment, I'm on the Human Research Ethics Committee with Debbie and a great team at Monash. And I'm also on clinical counsel at Monash as well. So I'm kept pretty busy with many mountains of reading every month. So just in terms of consumer involvement, I suppose there's things that are general that can be applied across the spectrum of health in terms of consumer involvement, and then some more specific things to do with HRECs. So over the years, one of the things I've noticed is, and Debbie and I talked about this too, health people can feel like a compulsion to involve consumers, so they can say, yes, we involve consumers. It can feel like a compulsion and something necessary and quick, let's get someone so we can say that consumers were involved. So I think that's, really a missed opportunity, because there's tremendous scope for consumers to be involved, not at a point in time so that there can be an indication that, yes, there was consumer involvement, but consumer involvement is quite dynamic. So you can have consumers at different points along the process. And I think it's also important to understand that, we're a diverse group of people. I work as a book editor and a bookseller editing at home as well. So my skills and my background is very different from someone else. And so consumers disagree with each other, just like doctors disagree on clinical counsel or HREC. So I think there needs to be, you don't need to follow everything that a consumer says but it's part of the mix, and it's better if the mix is more than one consumer and different points along the journey. So, for example, you might say, let's do a survey. Let's have some consumer involvement in how people understand this survey, or, you know, wording, because really one of the main areas that consumers can help when you're looking at research, if it's involving questionnaires or written surveys or online surveys, which is happening a lot now with COVID, is the language right? Do people understand what the question says? And you forget, because you guys would be so involved in the project, you know what you're saying. Sometimes it's good to have fresh eyes, but also one consumer may think one thing and one consumer may think another. And so there's a mix, and you have to incorporate those different views and say, well, that's addressing this, but it doesn't mean you get one consumer at one point in time and then do everything that they suggest and then that's it, right? So, you know, when we get projects that arrive at Nhmrc, there's a requirement at the start of the study for researchers to state in plain language a simple statement about what is your project about and what are you trying to do. And we often sit around the table and we try to dissect and understand what's meant to be a very plain, simple statement that really doesn't make sense to the ordinary person. So if you involve consumers in your research, just saying, does this make sense to you? Do you understand what it's saying? Because people who are so embedded in the jargon or the medical technological language can forget what it's like to not know that. And so even though a lot of researchers, I think, make great endeavours to try and make things easily understandable to people without medical or scientific expertise, they sometimes fail because they don't know what it's not like to have that knowledge, right? So, you know, language is a key thing where you can involve consumers. I mean, the example that Debbie gave before about the blood, it can also be something like from left field that no one has even thought of like that. It's just a different perspective. And I find in our Nhmrcs, we've got a number of consumers and a number of medical and scientific people, and it's a dynamic process. So consumer involvement is like adding extra strings to your bow. So as well as having the endocrinologist, the cardiologist, you know, the expert in, you know, something else, it's like another area of expertise or different voices that in the end makes things richer and better, and you see things from a new perspective. So yeah, so I suppose the key message is not looking at consumer involvement at one point in time and then it's done, to see it as something that can engage people, but it also doesn't mean that people have to or should commit for a long period of time if that's not what they want. So sometimes, like I've done at Monash, a question gets sent around, look, we've got a couple of brochures that need consumer review, who's available to do it? So you might just have one point in time go, oh, well, didn't know anything about this disease, let's look at the patient information brochure and give some feedback on that. If this was presented to someone in my family, would I understand it? So some consumer involvement may be very discreet and at a point in time, others may have ongoing involvement, but you need to be clear about what people are signing up for. So for example, a consumer on a Nhmrc knows that there's a minimum of one lengthy meeting once a month, which is sometimes twice a month or twice a week, like last week. And you have to be aware that there's a lot of reading and a lot of preparation involved. Okay, so I can do that and I understand what's involved, but someone else might not. But it doesn't mean that you're not valuable in some other funded way and would be much better suited to me at some other consumer involvement task. So I think just like the mix of scientific and medical specialties around the table, consumers are like that too. And one isn't enough. One is just a voice, a point in time. You know, mix it in and out. You know, there's people there willing to help make research better, help medicine be better for all of us as a society and a community. And we want great research because then it translates into health outcomes that we can all benefit from. But yeah, consumer involvement when preparing research to present it to a Nhmrc, language is really important, and also Of course, a patient information and consent form is quite clear to us when that's written totally by a researcher without consumer involvement, because we can't really understand it. So, and I don't want to become a pseudo doctor, that I understand all the technology and the terms to the point that I can understand a PICF that's not intelligible to someone else in my family, right? So I don't want to have to, you know, like, it's inevitable that I know a lot from my long time involvement in health, but I try and also consciously keep my hat on as just an ordinary member of the public out there. What would my mum think if she was reading this? Would she understand it? Because, you know, I have to make sure that I'm not also accepting things that 10 years ago I wouldn't have, because I didn't have the knowledge that I have now. So we also have to keep on our toes about it as well. So, but happy to answer questions at the end. I'll stop talking before I take up too much time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pauline, for those insights. Some comments coming through in the chat, endorsing many of the points that you're making. Firstly, around that sometimes consumers, we can draw from the same pool of consumers, and often we need to engage more broadly. I think is really, really important. And also that as researchers or clinicians, often we're so immersed in this work that we don't actually step back to engage with others and ask them about is what we're actually saying, is it actually clear, is it obvious to you what this study is about? So your points were really well made. Thank you so much. Debbie, anything more from you? No? Okay, terrific. That's great. Thank you so much. We'll come back for questions towards the end of the session. I'd like to introduce now Angela Henjak. Angela is the Senior Manager of the Ethics and Research Governance Office at Alfred Health. And Angela's going to talk to us today about the many ways in which the Ethics Office engages with consumers. So over to you, Angela, and thanks so much for your presentation today.
Thanks, Angela. Sorry, is that working? Sorry, can you see the presentation? Great, thank you. And also thank you to Pauline, who has aptly described the functions of an ethics committee and also the challenges as well. So thank you, Pauline. So I'll start a little bit and just discuss the sort of the key principles that ethics committees apply, and also not the ethics committee, but also researchers need to address in their applications. So in designing the study and also presenting it to the ethics committee. So there are four key, oh sorry, I should start, the guidance is the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. And the four principles are, firstly, research merit and integrity. So looking at potential benefit, appropriate study design, respect for participants, the researchers having the appropriate qualifications. Justice, which ensures there's fair recruitment, fair inclusion, exclusion criteria, participants aren't unfairly burdened, and also research outcomes becoming available at the end of the study. Beneficence, which looks at balancing any potential risk against potential benefits, minimising harm, and constantly reviewing the study and stopping a study when the risks are no longer justified. And the final key principle is respect, so which is essentially abiding by the other principles, so research merit and integrity, justice and beneficence, but also having regard to the welfare beliefs, customs and cultural heritage of both individuals and the communities, respecting the privacy, confidentiality and cultural sensitivities, respecting the capacity of individuals to make their own decisions, but also empowering and supporting or protecting individuals when they lack the capacity to provide consent. Just to move forward to the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework, the Australian Safety Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare developed a National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. And the purpose of the framework is to embed clinical trials services into existing clinical and corporate governance systems. The framework is based on the existing National Safety and Quality Health Service standards, which are in place for all public and private hospitals and day procedure services. So the body that accredits hospitals every 3 years is the same body that is leading the clinical trial governance framework. And in terms of which I'll just refer to it now as the governance framework, there are 2 standards which need to be met. And the first one is a clinical governance standard. And secondly, which is the most pertinent to our discussion today, is partnering with consumers. There was a pilot to pilot the implementation of this draft framework, and Alfred Health was a participating site. And Georgia and Jack will talk a little bit about, they were one of the sites, studies that were involved in the pilot. And the expectation is that this framework will be finalised and implemented from January next year. So in terms, just to address the actual question about community engagement in the ethics review, this is essentially currently fulfilled by the role of the lay members like Pauline, who provide a community perspective. There is currently no specific requirement for an ethics committee to assess the amount or the appropriateness of the consumer and community involvement of individual studies, as opposed to grant applications where there is actually a requirement for consumer engagement. The framework is comprised of specific actions within each of the standards, so against which the health service will be assessed. And so the focus of my presentation is to show how the Ethics Committee contributes to compliance with some of these actions in the 2 standards, and predominantly the engagement with consumer standard. But just to also mention that the values and principles in both are the same. Everything is centred around the patient and the participant. So the 2 actually do align with respect to how that looks in terms of respecting consumers and patients as individuals and meeting their specific needs. So I'll just go through some of the relevant actions, because there are quite a few actions that need to be met, and hence why it's going to take health services a considerable amount of time to be able to comply with all of the actions. So one of the actions is that the health service organisation has organisation-wide incident management, information management and investigation systems that support the workforce to recognise and report incidents, and also use that information to improve safety and quality. So the Ethics Committee has a role in that it does review safety information. So any adverse events, side effects that occur during a trial are required to be reported to the Ethics Committee. And there is a stratification in terms of that, but we won't get into that at the moment. So the Alfred Hospital Ethics Committee is a little bit unique in that we actually have a subcommittee which deals with emerging issues in ethics and research, and they also issue guidance. So not every ethics committee will be issuing guidance on particular subjects. Often it's the institution, and then there are also national and international guidance. So but our committee is fortunate to have this committee that does create guidance for researchers. And the other thing that's important in terms of the role of the Ethics Committee is to ensure that the information about potential risks is explained in the patient information and consent form. And over time, that does change in the study. So there are new side effects or other issues. So it's also important to ensure that that patient information sheet is constantly updated so participants have the most up-to-date information and able to make decisions about their continued participation. Another one of the actions requires a health service to have processes in place to seek regular feedback from patients, carers and their families. And the Ethics Committee has a role in that as well, in that it receives and manages inquiries and complaints from research participants and their families. And often, thankfully we don't get too many complaints, but often they help to shape how the information sheet is structured. So, you know, if there is something that is very unclear in the information sheet, then we'll go back to the research to say, well, you know, we received this feedback, it would be worthwhile. We would suggest that you change it to make it clear to participants going forward. And sometimes even the study design, you know, so we have, as I said, unfortunately, it is managed as complaints, but occasionally the Ethics Committee does receive other feedback which is important and valuable. Another action requires the health service to ensure that its informed consent processes comply with legislation and best practice. So the Ethics Committee is charged with ensuring that the appropriate form of consent is sought in the circumstances. So usually it is written, but on occasion verbal consent, and also the use of telehealth and e-consent, which has certainly come to fore last year with the pandemic, which most of you have probably used outside of clinical trials. It also has to ensure that there is appropriate consent or not, depending on the legislation, for patients who cannot consent for themselves. So that could be seeking consent from a medical treatment decision maker, as the case in Victoria. Again, our committee has issued guidance, but the other matter is to consider whether on occasion a waiver for the requirement for consent is appropriate. That doesn't usually happen with clinical trials, but it does happen for other kinds of research. And again, all of these issues need to be within the legislation, so comply with the legislation as well. And sort of following on from the previous action, the health service has to have the process to identify the capacity of a patient to make an assessment, to have the capacity to provide consent, and also a substitute decision maker if the patient, you know, is not lacking capacity. So the role of the Ethics Committee is to, and this is particularly challenging for research done in the emergency setting, so ambulance studies, emergency department, ICU, and also studies where patients lack a capacity for other reasons, so for example dementia, Alzheimer's and other mental health conditions. So the challenge for the Ethics Committee is to ensure that the enrolment of patients is lawful and that the appropriate patient information sheet or brochure is provided to the patient and or the substitute decision maker. So it depends on the legislation is very complicated in this area, and so there are various provisions depending upon whether the study is being done in an emergency setting or whether there is more time. The patient may not have capacity, but there may be time in which a medical treatment decision maker may be approached. So all that needs to be taken into account when looking at what information is provided to patients and their families. Sometimes it's just a brochure. So if there's been patients are enrolled in the emergency setting without their consent, and then by the time, and it's a very short procedure, so you know, the treatment or the therapy or the intervention is over by the time the patient is able to provide consent later on, or the medical treatment decision maker. So sometimes just a brochure explaining to the participant or their family what's actually occurred and provide some further information on what happens to their data, and an option to withdraw is sufficient in that circumstance. The Ethics Committee also seeks evidence of researchers understanding the legislation. Now that's a really tall order, but essentially it's based on a document that the researchers provide to the committee, which is a step-by-step on all the steps that need to be taken before that patient can be enrolled. And the last two actions I've grouped together because they're similar. The first one is that the health service uses communication mechanisms that are tailored to the diversity of consumers. And secondly, that the organisation supports clinicians in communicating with their patients, carers, families and consumers in a way that the information is provided in a way that meets their needs, is easy to understand and use, and it includes information about their ongoing care. And Pauline mentioned some of the challenges that are related to ensuring that actually does happen. So the role of the Ethics Committee in against those two standards is, firstly, there are quite a number of actions involving people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So the role of the Ethics Committee is to ensure that it follows the guidance in these two documents, which are also prepared by the Nhmrc, and to ensure that the appropriate prior reviews and approvals have been obtained. So in many of the jurisdictions, studies involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples need to go to specific ethics committees. That's not the case in Victoria, but we still need to ensure that those prior reviews have been undertaken. And secondly, if the committee does not have the appropriate expertise, to consult the experts to ensure that all the cultural sensitivities and are met in terms of the application going forward. And the other role that the committee has is, as Pauline's mentioned, lay members review the patient information sheets and other patient-facing material. It's also to ensure that there is a patient information sheet for all the participants. So sometimes in studies there are carers from whom information is collected about the participant, but that also makes them participants in the study. You know, there's a consent form should a partner or even a participant become pregnant. And thirdly, if there is a medical treatment decision maker involved in the study, there's an appropriate PICF for them. The information sheet, or PICF, sorry, I've been using that term interchangeably, or should also include information about post-study arrangements. So if there's at the end of the trial, what will happen? Will that medication would be available to you at the end of the study or not? So all that needs to be explained. It's also important when looking at the participants being able to understand the information, that interpreters or use of translated PICFs are also considered, and also other media for consent. We found more recently there's interactive types of consent on tablets or online, which may be useful in the different settings. And so just wanted to finish up with what's not known at this time, and hopefully will become more apparent over the coming months, is whether there will be a role for the Ethics Committee in assessing the community and consumer engagement. One of the challenges will be how we engage with sponsors, particularly overseas sponsors running multi-centre trials. One of the issues that the inclusion and exclusion criteria of studies are very restrictive. So many of them will have a lack of proficiency in the English language as an exclusion criteria. So that will exclude obviously a lot of people for whom English is not their first language. And similarly, how will it work in terms of local consumer engagement for these studies? So working with sponsors will hopefully help to address that. And finally, what's not known is how clinical trials will be assessed in the accreditation. We had a number of trials that underwent this mock assessment, but it'd be interesting to see what it will actually look like once the framework has been implemented. And Georgia and Jack will be able to address some of these questions in their presentation about how how consumer engagement was very successful in attracting a trial. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela, for that presentation, and I certainly learned, had a much deeper understanding around the various ways in which the ethics committees engage with consumers and the community. Thanks so much. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Jack Germain and Georgia Ramsey from Alfred Health. Jack and Georgia are both clinical research coordinators at the Alfred Hospital, and they've got a lot of experience in trials in a range of neurological conditions, brain tumours, movement disorders, epilepsy, and some neurodevelopmental disorders. And they're going to tell us today about a very innovative and interesting clinical trial that they're involved in running at the Alfred, and how consumers have been involved in and contributed to the development of that. So welcome, Jack and Georgia, and over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to be involved in today's seminar. So we're going to be talking about a specific clinical trial, and as Angela mentioned previously, we were involved in a governance framework pilot a couple of months ago that gave us the opportunity to really deeply consider the role of consumers in this particular clinical trial. So I'll hand over to Jack to give a bit of background about Rett syndrome, because it's really important to understand the participants that have been involved in the trial. But the clinical trial is looking at blarcamesine as a treatment for a condition called Rett syndrome. So Jack, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Georgia. So yeah, I've been working in clinical trials for a number of years, and yeah, Rett syndrome is one of those ones. It's a very complex neurological disorder, which is caused by a mutation in the MECP2 gene. So the prevalence of this condition is estimated to be between 1 in 10,000 to 23,000 female births. So it's approximately 400 Australian girls that are living with Rett syndrome. These patients have extremely complex medical needs. And so, as Angela was mentioning before, we need the medical treatment decision maker consent form to consent these girls to the trial, and obviously working with their parents or carers, as they're the best source of information for these particular patients. So the clinical features of this condition involve loss of language and motor skills, hand stereotypes such as ringing, clapping hands, and mouthing with their hands, swallowing difficulties, scoliosis, and often they have seizures, which is an area that we work in epilepsy. So, yeah, as I mentioned before, so due to these conditions, we were heavily reliant on the carers throughout the clinical trial. So bringing the Nhmrc Rett clinical trial to Australia. So representatives of the Rett Syndrome Association are actually parents themselves, you know, people living with Rett syndrome, and they directly approached Nhmrc, who's the sponsor of this trial, requesting that the trial be brought to Australia. And this is not the usual process of how commercial sponsors work. They usually contact a doctor and then, you know, select a service to run the trial without really knowing the patient population. So after initial contact with the association, it was up to them to prove to the sponsor that Australia was a good place to bring this particular trial. And also the Rett Foundation themselves raised some money in order to help get the patients to the hospital, along with the commercial sponsor helping them as well, helping from a funding point of view. So hand back to Georgia for the next stage.
Yeah, so in the early stages of the clinical trial process, there was a lot of input from the association in terms of protocol development. So there's some limitations that this has based on the needs to have coordinated approaches to assessing different aspects of a clinical trial, because the sponsor was conducting some other clinical trials in Rett syndrome around the globe. But the association was still able to give some really helpful suggestions to that protocol development stage. Other suggestions and input that were given by the association that were particularly useful included suggesting that we conduct our study visits early in the morning, and that's for two reasons. So from a logistics perspective, it meant that our interstate participants could get on flights, as early as possible to get back home. But it was also really important because a lot of our participants were, at their best earlier in the day. So many of our participants would need a nap in the afternoon and need to recover from whatever they'd been up to in the morning. So we wanted to make sure that the time that we were spending with our participants and their carers was when our participants were at their best. In the first stage of the clinical trial, once we were up and running, we were involved in a pharmacokinetic phase of the study. And so this was quite intensive and involved overnight stays for a small number of participants. And we worked really closely with the association to make sure that the needs of our participants and their families were really well considered and catered to. So this involved one-to-one nursing ratios to make sure that appropriate care was available very quickly. And things that also needed to be considered were plenty of space for wheelchairs and a bed for the carer or the parent to stay with their daughter overnight. And something that we hadn't really thought about much at all before the trial started was brought to our attention by our contacts at the association, in that many of the potential participants were particularly difficult to obtain blood samples from. So that meant that we got our anaesthetics team on board and were available to perform cannulations for when the patients were admitted. So we wanted that process to be as smooth and painless as possible. And then throughout the clinical trial, once we were actually up and running, myself and Jack had very, very frequent contact with our contacts at the association so that we could discuss recruitment. And this was really important because many families had a preference to speak to someone that they knew at the association first. They obviously have a very tight-knit community, and that was very reassuring for families to be able to contact the association and get a little bit of background information from them first. And then we had plenty of logistical challenges that popped up along the way. So having support from the association was really important from that perspective as well. So why does consumer engagement matter? So we all know it's really important. But with this particular clinical trial, we were looking at a group of participants with a rare condition, and it's a condition that's quite severe, especially into adulthood, and the participants have really complex needs. So it demanded really close collaboration by everyone who was involved. It was really pivotal that we had really strong engagement early on to make sure that we had a good understanding of how many potential participants was in the Australian community for us to get in touch with once we were activated to run the clinical trial. And finally here, many families who care for a person who has Rett syndrome have had some challenging and sometimes not very pleasant experiences with the health system. So it was really reassuring for many families knowing that the Rett Syndrome Association had been so heavily involved through the process of getting the clinical trial to Australia and then getting it running once we'd actually been activated. So strong engagement with consumers is essential for success from a number of different perspectives. So it, in this instance particularly, showed us that we were able to really prioritise the needs of our participants and their carers. It also meant that we were able to get in touch with the families of 40 potential participants. They were considered for participation at the Alfred Hospital, and that's pretty impressive considering that we think there's about 400 individuals in Australia who have Rett syndrome. And then a number of participants who completed the trial with us continued to be seen clinically through the epilepsy service at the Alfred. And that really comes down to the fact that the families were appreciative of the fact that we have a service where our doctors understand the complexities of Rett syndrome, and obviously those families had a positive experience through the clinical trial. And finally, from a the biggest perspective, I guess, it provides really strong evidence that Australian sites can successfully conduct clinical trials for rare conditions in patient populations with complex needs. And going forward, this means that I would hope that sponsors would look at Australian sites as a really good location to bring clinical trials for rare conditions, to ensure that people who have these rare conditions still have access to clinical trials that provide really brilliant opportunities. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Georgia and Jack, for a really interesting presentation. And yes, absolutely an example of the pull of from consumers and people with a lived experience. So thank you so much. We've got a number of questions that have come through the chat and the Q&A. I'm just going to hand over to Sandy for a couple of the questions that have come through the chat, Sandy, and then I'll pick up a couple in the Q&A.
Sure. So they seem to be pretty broadly approached, so feel free to answer anyone on the panel. Does the NHMRC national statement have anything to say about the responsibility of researchers to feedback research outcomes to participants, consumers post-study?
I'm happy to take this one, Sandy.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, there is a requirement to share information. So disseminate information. Participants have given up their time, and so as you know, as a minimum, that information should be available to them at the end of the study. So the ethics application form that researchers are required to complete actually pulls out elements of the national statement, one of which specifically asks about dissemination of information at the end of the study. So it would be an expectation, yes.
Fabulous, thank you. There's another question asking, are there any guidelines for what would be considered an appropriate way to e-consent that would be approved by Nhmrc? Debbie?
So there's various, sorry, I know the volume can be difficult. There's the NHMRC, from what we can gather, don't have specific guidelines for e-consent. So what essentially though, I think it's important to realise when submitting an ethics application that you know, the e-consent or written consent, it's only one part of the entire process. So what an ethics committee is looking at is the entire recruitment and informed consent process, from how people, potential participants, are identified as being suitable to be approached to be in the study, how that approach is made, how the informed consent discussion and process takes place, what information and tools will be available, what time will be allowed, what are the other tools that will be made available to people, whether there'll be interpreters, a whole range of things. And really then how the documentation of consent is obtained is actually, the, if you like, the last consideration they'll be looking at. So from the limited number of applications that the Monash Ethics Committee have seen with e-consent, those applications have detailed very clearly what the various stages of the informed consent process look like. And they have built in both mechanisms for written informed consent as well as electronic informed consent. So it's covering the basis depending on some participants may not have the ability to have access to electronic forms of consent, and that may not be their preference. So whilst there aren't guidelines specifically, it's taken that there should be attention paid to the entire process and explaining what that is and how it's documented is really the last step.
Thanks, Debbie. This is a bit of a comment as well as a question. So, Georgia and Jack, has your presentation been written up anywhere? They'd like to share it with the childhood cancer community. So is there anything written up that you would be able to share?
No, we haven't got anything formally written up, but very happy to be contacted by anyone who is wanting further information. I'm sure we could put something together for them.
Thank you. That's great. Another question, which I think, because Debbie, the opening slide that you started with very quickly might be appropriate here, is ATREC approval required for consumer focus groups? For example, when a consumer, when we ask consumers to retrospectively reflect or provide information about their personal experience of health services.
So that's thanks. That's a really interesting one. So I guess we have to look at, in the context that we're talking today, a consumer involvement in research protocol design and I guess execution of research is what we're discussing. So there isn't human research ethics approval required for that, because a consumer is considered an expert who's providing expertise to the research team about what might be viable, what might be appropriate. When we're talking about focus groups, it really depends on, you know, what the purpose of that focus group is. Is it evaluating an aspect of a service delivered by a health service, or is it the purpose of the focus group? Is it qualitative research? It's not. I guess it really depends on the purpose of that focus group and what the aims are, before we could say whether ethics approval would be necessary. But I would welcome it up to the other panel members to share their thoughts.
I would agree, Debbie, with your explanation and delineation of the role of a consumer as a consultant or advisor, as opposed to being a participant and providing their views for, you know, a specific question or an evaluation.
Thank you both very much. We're starting to get short of time. I've got one more question for you, Angela. Have recently heard about sponsor trials that are now conducting patient experience interviews on their trials and amending ethics to do this? Do you know how ethics committees ensure that sponsors are suitably qualified to be talking to cancer patients and that the questions are known to those running the study?
Thanks, Sandy. So just to clarify, are the sponsors actually contacting the patients as opposed to researchers contacting patients? Because one of the I suppose principles is that there is that no direct contact, and so a sponsor should not have any identifiable information about a particular participant, unless of course, you know, they did agree to that, so, and consented to that. But yeah, so certainly patient-reported outcomes is increasing, and it's great to see, because it isn't just about the data that's collected that's shown that this drug is effective at this dose. It's you know, getting the patient's experience in terms of how has this trial affected or hopefully improved your life. So that they're absolutely crucial. But I don't recall having seen an application where it's actually the sponsor who is contacting it, particularly a commercial sponsor, as opposed to the research team who are actually running the research and already have information, identifiable information about the patient, and collecting this information. And also to be expected that the information that is collected is made re-identifiable or coded going forward. So yeah, thank you for alerting us to that. Something to look out for. Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much. I'll hand back over to you, Angela Jones.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks, everyone. I'm mindful that we've come up to 2 o'clock. We have got some questions that we haven't had a chance to get to. We'll try and link in with our panel and perhaps provide some responses to those in the summary that we send out in a week or so, with a link to the recording of the event. Just to remind you about, there's our online resources, and our session next month in September will be around how to incorporate consumer and community involvement into a grant application. So we look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, everyone, please stay safe and stay well, and don't hesitate to be in touch with us at any time. There's the details of our September seminar. And thanks so much for joining us today, and a particular thanks to our panellists for their presentations, which were really insightful. Thank you so much to Debbie, Dell, Angela, Henjak, Jack, and also to Pauline, that joined us, and to everybody that was here on the presentation today. We really enjoyed having you all involved, and thank you so much. And Georgia.